With an action node selected, we can access the parameters for that node in the lower part of the UI. And we can see that action has a wide variety of different parameters you can access by clicking on any of the buttons from the action bin to the media to the object, the source, and the output. We know the action tool currently has two different layers available to it because of the outputs that we've created. And by default, action always has a default camera when you create an action node. If I go to the Object tab, you can see that the default camera is what is currently selected. Besides seeing the default camera's name on this tab, if you look over on the right-hand side, you see this field here that gives you the name of whatever is currently selected. And you see it reads Default Cam. When you're looking at the Connect Effect schematic and the action node is selected, you can start to use the next and previous buttons to navigate through the different objects that you can select within the side of action. And as I click and navigate between the different axes that are available to us to the different images that are available to us based on the two layers that I've created, this isn't the most efficient way of selecting or accessing the elements that are inside the action module. The action node itself has its own schematic, and it's a different type of schematic than what we have for our Connect Effect schematic. The Connect Effect schematic is a flowchart of one element going into another until we finally reach the end result. The action schematic allows you to select and access the different parameters and different elements or objects that you have inside your 3D scene. It also allows you to control how different elements interact and work with each other in the 3D environment. I like to refer to it as stepping in this node. So inside this action node is a full 3D environment, and I want to access the nodes that are inside of here, meaning my two layers and my camera right now. With this Connect Effect schematic activated, I can go over to my view list and I can choose the action schematic. You can also use the escape key as a hotkey. But when I choose this, we can see we have nodes that represent the different objects that we have inside of our 3D scene. First of all, we have our default camera, as I mentioned. And then we also have the axes that are applied to each individual layer when they are created. And we have the image source that is associated with that individual layer. The parameters below will change, again, very similar to the Connect Effect schematic. Whatever object I select, the parameters will change in the lower region of my UI to give me the parameters relevant to that selected object. So if I select the axis number 1, which is the axis for image number 1, you'll see in the bottom tab it reads axis 1, and I have all the parameters that are relevant to that individual axis. Also, by default, the image that is associated with that axis will be available to me over on the right-hand side. If I select axis number 2, you'll notice that the tab read axis number 2, and these parameters are relevant to that axis, and of course, image number 2 is now the active image that I can access on the right-hand side. You can rename any nodes very easily by selecting the node, and then the name field right over here, I can click in it to activate it, then I can change or alter the name. So now you'll see in the schematic the name has been changed to Axis 2 Graphic. I could do the same for the image if I wanted to. If I select image number 1, I can rename this Image 1 City, and I can select the axis and also rename that Axis 1 City. You'll notice that all the tabs with the names that represent the selected objects and the name itself in the schematic will change accordingly. When the action tool is the selected and active tool, you'll notice you have an option to access the action bin. When I click on this, you'll see, again, we get a bin filled with different tools, but these are relevant to working in a 3D environment of action. Remember, we can access the Connect Effect nodes by clicking on the button that reads Effects Nodes. Now I have access to all the different tools that are relevant to working in Connect Effects. These tools are irrelevant when working inside the action schematic. If I disable that once again, you'll notice with the action bin selected, here are all the tools that are relevant to working in action. For example, if I want to add a light into my scene to relight the 3D environment, you have the light tool right here. Just for reference, the same hotkey works as far as focusing different nodes and tools inside the bin. Meaning, if I hit a letter on my keyboard, all the tools that start with that letter will be the ones that are highlighted. So I hit the L key, you'll notice the lens texture, the light, and the lens flare are the only tools that are highlighted. I can now pick up a light and drag and drop it into my schematic. Once I do, you'll see the node has been added into the schematic, and you'll now see an icon that represents the light itself. I can grab the light and start to manipulate and move it around inside of my scene. The action bin is still active down here inside the UI. I can click on the Object tab to access the parameters relevant to the selected object, and you'll see that Light 1 is the currently selected node. Once again, if I go back to the action bin and I want to access the object parameters for the light very quickly, I just double click on it. The lower UI will change and show me the object parameters for that selected light that I double clicked on. The light itself has several different parameters, such as its position, rotation, color, what type of light is it, its intensity, its spread, and so on. I would like to take this light back in Z space and light the entire scene. So I'll drag my Z positioner so that the light moves back into scene. I can manipulate my viewports or zoom in and out of the view to see the light icon. You can move your nodes around and organize them. Remember, this schematic is not a flow chart schematic, what Connect Effects is. This is an object selection and how each element will interact or affect each other in the action environment. For example, the default axes that are applied to the images, you'll see there is the connection line and an arrow indicating the flow of the control, meaning this axis is a parent of this image. Right now, each individual axis allows me to control the individual image. For example, with the axis for the graphic selected, if I start to scale this down or manipulate it with the parameters down below, I'm going to be affecting the image based on the adjustments I'm making to this axis. Let me undo that. If I select the axis for the city and do the same thing, obviously I'm going to affect the image that is the background city. Let me undo that. I can rotate the axis scene. You have full transformation in the 3D environment with the axes that you apply. If I wanted to create a parent axis that would affect both these axes, I can do so by going back to my action bin. You'll see over here I have an axis node. If I drag that out and drop it, you'll notice right now it is not connected to anything. I can bring my cursor to the very edge of the axis and click and drag away, and you'll see a connection line is now being drawn off of it. And if I drop it on this axis, it is now connected. You'll see this is now the parent of this axis. I can disconnect this in the same way as I do inside the Connect Effects. By clicking and dragging across a connection line, you'll see that we can create the cut. In the action schematic, if I want to use the auto link option by holding a hotkey, it is the Shift key in action. If I hold the Shift key down and I take one node and touch or kiss the other node, I can make the connections. So now I've clicked on both these nodes, and now axis number 1 is parent of both of these. With this axis selected, if I scale or manipulate, you'll see both the image of the Paris graphic and the city are now manipulated and being scaled. You still have individual control for the different images used on the layers with the original axes that were applied to them. So rotating or scaling those independently is still available. You can also control what images the lights will affect. For example, I've got my light that I've positioned in the Z space, and I want it to only affect the background image, the city scene. Over where it reads Tools, if I click, you'll see a wide variety of tools that you can access. Going up to the top, you'll see one that's called the Light Link. The Shift L is the shortcut to access that. When I choose that, you'll notice my cursor changes to a different icon. And now, if I go to my light and I drag off of the light, you'll see there is a blue line that I'm drawing off of this node. And if I drop it onto the image 1 city, it's now going to affect only that image. You'll notice immediately the graphic of Paris has become black because there is no light affecting that image. To return back to my Select tool, I go to my Tools and I choose Select or use the shortcut of Shift M. Now if I go back to my node bin, I can locate another light by hitting the L key and take this light and drag this in, and a new light has been added in the scene. So now I have 2 lights. I'll double click on this light's node to access its parameters, and we'll take this in Z space out a little bit. I also want to change the spread of this light, and now you can see the cone shape of the light and how it's going to interact and affect the graphic and the background. Again, I'll take this in Z space and drag this back a little bit here. Then I'll make some more adjustments to the light as far as its position and its rotation. Now I'd like to take the graphic of Paris and move it forward in Z space. Now I want to manipulate the image one city. So if I select that, this is now the active parameters. I would like to bend this image. So under the surface controls for image one underscore city, where it reads flat, I'll expand this and I'll choose bicubic. Now you'll see that I receive corner points for the image plus Bezier handles that allow me to manipulate and bend this image. I'll region select all the Bezier handles. And on the parameters below, under the vertices, I'll drag the Z position to a negative value, which in turn bends my image. And then with the axis selected for that image, I will scale it up so that it fills the frame. I'll select light number 2 once again, and I'll position it even further back in Z space. Now I would like to have this light that I've created, light 2, have shadows being cast from the graphic reading Paris onto the backplate. To do that, I'm going to go to my Action Node bin. My light is selected. I'll come down to my bin and I'll locate the Shadow Cast tool. With that light selected, I can just double click on it inside the bin and you'll see that it is automatically attached to the light. Again, you can see the connection line, showing me that the light is the parent of the Shadow Cast. And if we want to access the Shadow Cast parameters, I double click on them and the Shadow Cast parameters become available. Now I can soften the shadows, and controlling the intensity of the light is obviously going to affect the shadows. Now if I select the light and start to manipulate and move it around in 3D space, you can see how the shadows are being cast on the backplate. I'd like to animate my camera to move, so I need to select the camera. So I click on my camera node, and the camera parameters become available to me. I'll turn on the auto key option down here in the lower right corner. This means any parameters I change will create keyframes. At the first frame, I'm going to adjust my X for the eye to approximately 300. And then I'll jump to the last frame using the last frame button by the playback controls, and I'll reposition the X for the eye to be a negative 300. So now I've animated my camera to move over these frames. With my action schematic selected, I'd like to switch this view to be an overview or top view, looking down on my scene. So from my view menu, I'll go to my Action 3D Views, and from the pop-up, I'll choose the top view. I'll zoom out using the zoom percentage slider, and now we can see a representation of the background that I bent because it's a bicubic. You can see the different icons for the lights, and you can see the icon for the camera. And as I scrub, you can see the animation for the X value of the eye that I created. What I'd like to have is my backplate, the city scene, always following the movement of the camera. I want to go back to my schematic view, so I'm going to hit the Escape key with the top view selected. Just as with the lights, we can control what the light affects. We can also control what an axis is doing based on the movement of the camera with what's called a Look At tool. So once again, I go to my tool flyout, and this time I'll use the Look At tool. Then I'll click on the original axis that was created when we created a layer for the city image, and drag away, and you'll see now I have an orange connection line. When I bring it to the camera and drop it, you'll notice in the player the image snapped to look at the camera. Now if I scrub my playback, we can see that the camera is still moving, but the back plate is now going to always look at the camera. I'll return back to my Select tool, and let's switch this view to be a top view once again. So I'll go back to the Action 3D Views, and I'll choose Top. Now we can see that the backplate, our city image, is moving with the animation of the camera so that it is always looking directly at the camera. I'll hit the Escape key again to go back to my schematic. If I select Axis 2 underscore graphic, I want to create some keyframes for this also. So I'm at the first frame and Auto key is on. I'm going to move it closer to the camera, but by doing so, I would like to have the light move with it. So let me undo that for a second by using Command Z. Now, if I click off the axis that is for the graphic and drag that to the light and release it, you'll notice the light changed its position because now this axis is going to be apparent to the light. And with this axis selected for the graphic, if I start to move or manipulate the Z position for this, you'll notice that the light is going to follow suit and move with it because it is now a child of this axis. So this is just a quick look at the action schematic view and how the nodes allow you to not only select the different objects to access their parameters, but how you can build relationships between the different elements in the 3D environment.